It's lovely to see so many people here. It's quite appropriate at the time of the party conferences happening that and political debate being at the forefront of the news, that we should talk about politics 350 years ago. And this afternoon we're delighted to welcome John Rees, who's a writer, broadcaster and campaigner. He's also visiting research fellow at Goldsmiths, University of London, and he's writing a book on the Levellers based on his doctoral research. So I think it's fair to say he knows a lot about this subject. So I'm hoping that we will go away with new insights about events that happened here in Poole and in the wider country 350 years ago. So I'd just like to hand over to John Rees.
Thanks very much, Jenny. My thanks both to you, to the Museum Society, and to Hayden Wheeler, who organised the talk. It's a pleasure to be here. It is a very interesting subject because Poole, at the time that we're going to be talking about, was a microcosm of some of the larger politics that were taking place in revolutionary England, and you can't really make sense of what was happening to John Rede, who was the military governor of Poole from 1647 to 1651. You can't make sense of what was happening to him without some wider context. So the first thing I'm going to do is just supply a little bit of that. So let's just have a think about some of the things that were happening to the parliamentary side of the Civil War in 1647, in the year in which Rede was appointed Governor of Poole. So at this point, the first Civil War has ended. The king has lost in the decisive battle, the Battle of Naseby in 1645, and the whole country is in a state of political ferment about what now will be the settlement. The king has been defeated on the battlefield, but what is now going to be the political settlement that emerges from the Civil War? And within the parliamentary camp, there are very different answers to that question. In fact, ever since the war began, there have been two predominant views of what the war was about. For some on the parliamentary side, the war was about forcing the king to come to a more reasonable settlement with his parliament and a less autocratic cast of government than the one that he'd been operating in the 11 years of personal rule and he'd done without parliament before the Civil War began. So famously, even though they're on the battlefield fighting a war against the king, the parliament side quite frequently goes into battle with, on their battle flags, the phrase "for king and parliament," which is an odd thing to do when the outcome of the battle is going to be the defeat of the king's army. There are other people who, from relatively early on, think that the king is untrustworthy, and that if there's going to be any settlement at all with the king, and there's a question mark over that, it has to be a much more radical settlement in which his powers are very, very seriously restricted. During the course of the war, as this becomes a longer and more bloody and drawn-out affair, this view certainly becomes a very more influential view in the parliamentarian side. I suppose it's summed up by Oliver Cromwell himself when he says at one point, "If I see the king in the body of the enemy, I would as soon discharge my pistol upon him as upon any common man." In other words, this is going to be a fight to the death. And inside the parliamentary side, there's a kind of fight the war till it ends up in a compromise view, and there's a kind of win the war at any cost view. And these are very, very entrenched views by the time the first Civil War has ended in the defeat of the king, and the two camps might be broadly characterised, are broadly characterised historically, as Presbyterians and Independents. The Presbyterians, by and large, want a national church with authority over all the local churches with a church hierarchy of some description. Their opponents, which Oliver Cromwell and his son-in-law, Commissary General Henry Ireton, are the leading figures, are known as the Independents, because they will defend and are members of independent churches which have, in a sense, organisational independence from the national church. They don't believe that the sovereign or any government should be able to dictate to believers how they should worship, the ways in which they should worship. And we'll find all the way through this story the intermingling of church matters, of religious belief and politics. It could hardly be otherwise. The church is, if you like, in the 17th century, it's the equivalent of the civil service, parts of the legal apparatus, the media, and government at this point. So it's an institution of governance, and it matters a great deal who controls the church and how worship is decided and what worship says. Charles I, Father James I had put this brilliantly when he said, "No bishops, no king." If you do away with hierarchy in the church, you're going to end up doing away with hierarchy in the state as well. So these religious and political matters are inseparable during this period, and at the point this begins, 1647, there are the Presbyterians who favour a nationally governed church and are more conservative and moderate and want a settlement with the king, and there are independents who have gone further than this, who want to see an independent church governance without the interference of the state over matters of conscience, and that these independent churches are becoming places where political radicalism is spreading both within the New Model Army and in the City of London and other places as well. So briefly, a few things that happen in this year. In April, because the Presbyterian, the moderate majority in the House of Commons, wants rid of the radical New Model Army as quickly as possible. It tries to disband the army, and when it isn't trying to disband it, it's trying to send it to Ireland. There's a revolt in the army about this. They haven't been paid. They don't particularly want to go to Ireland, and most of all, they suspect that once they're out of the way, a conservative deal will be struck with the king, which they don't like. And in the regiments of the army, there are people called agitators. The word in the 17th century simply means agents, hasn't acquired its kind of a modern meaning at that point, are elected. First time ever, I think, in the standing army where the regiments meet and democratically elect their own representatives to confront the grandees, as they're called, the senior officers of the army, with a series of radical political demands. There's one name that we need to remember in the course of this. Edward Sexby is a sympathiser of the London Levellers, the most radical of the parliamentary camp, and he is key to organising the agitators in the New Model Army. He's the man who gets them a printing press. He's the man who runs off their radical pamphlets, gets them distributed. He's the man who creates a network of agents among the agitators who confront the powers that be. In June, the king is already essentially a prisoner of the new Model Army, but the agitators suspect, and perhaps Oliver Cromwell also suspects, that the Presbyterians, the moderates, are going to take hold of the king and use him as a bargaining chip in this post-war contest about what the society is going to look like. So either with Cromwell's nod and a wink, or perhaps with his direct connivance, certainly with the encouragement of the agitators, Cornet George Joyce, a very lowly officer in the army, that's another name to remember, George Joyce, along with Edward Sexby, rides with a troop of horse to Holdenby House in the East Midlands, where the king is being held, and takes possession of him, basically, takes possession of the person of the king, basically on behalf of the senior officers of the army. And the king, first of all, attempts to refuse to go with Joyce and says to him, "By what commission do you come here? By what commission do you demand I go with you?" And Joyce famously turns around and points to the armed soldiers from the New Model Army who are behind him and says, "This is my commission." and the king, to be fair to him, says it's as fair a commission as I ever saw. And so the radicals now have possession of the king. That's June. By August, there are serious attempts to mount a kind of counter-revolution within London, and the army, the New Model Army, comes to London. It marches across the only bridge across the Thames, London Bridge. It's let in by London citizens. The first regiment across the bridge is the regiment of Thomas Rainsborough, who's a Leveller sympathiser in the army, and essentially the army takes control of the capital. In October, there is a meeting of the elected agitators of the army, a remarkable meeting. Starts off in Putney Church on its first day. The debates that took place there from late October into until the 11th of November, the Putney debates, written down, transcribed by the clerk of the army, William Clark, discovered only hundreds of years later by historians in the late 19th century, are still to this day an incredible record of ordinary soldiers and lower officers confronting the most powerful senior commanders in the army and debating with them whether or not, or how democratic the settlement of the country is going to be. And on the left of this debate are the agitators and their representatives from London, including John Wildman, one of the leading Leveller figures, and this is what they debate out. Famously in that debate, summed up in many ways by an interchange between Henry Arton and Thomas Rainsborough. Thomas Rainsborough says that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the richest he, and I see no reason why any man should put himself under a government that he hasn't first had a hand in choosing. Fundamentally a democratic statement of what the settlement of the country should look like. And in reply to this, Henry Arton says, all that I say, in other words, all my objections to this, all that I say is because I have an eye to property. And he and Cromwell say, if you let people have too much democracy, they're going to take away private property. And it's in these debates that the term Leveller is first used about the supporters of John Lilburne, like John Wildman, and so on. So this is, by any stretch of the imagination, already a revolutionary year. It looks as if John Rede was present at the Putney debates. He is Lieutenant Colonel Rede, and there was also another Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Rede. So it makes it difficult to be exactly precise about which Lieutenant Colonel Rede in the record is speaking. But I would say, given the context of his relationship with the Levellers, it's likely to be John Rede. And one other thing that makes it even more likely, and this brings us to John Rede and Poole, on the very last day of the Putney debates, Thomas Fairfax, the senior commander of the New Model Army, appoints this John Rede as Governor of Poole. There had been a previous suggestion, which Fairfax had turned down. The previous suggestion, interestingly, was that John Wildman, who's a civilian Leveller, should be made military governor of Poole. Fairfax refuses that, but he appoints this guy, John Rede. So here he is. Let's just have a little bit of a think about him. This, by the way, is a portrait from the National Army Museum, and it very, very probably is John Rede, although there are things in the description at the National Army Museum which are untrue. It says, for instance, that he spent some time in America, which he didn't. And it's also slightly odd, and I'm not an expert on costume and hairstyles in the 17th century, but the periwig looks a little older than 1650, which is the supposed date of it. Although, you see pictures of William Walwyn, one of the Levellers, with a periwig on, and one of the Leveller women, Catherine Chidley, says that the Levellers used to disguise themselves from the forces of the state by going around disguised in periwigs, so that may not be decisive. But anyway, this is most probably John Rede. We can't trace the provenance because of the portrait. It was gifted to the National Army Museum in the 60s from a private family. The only distant relation of which I found surviving is the actor Daniel Day-Lewis, and I don't think he knows what was happening in the family back in the 60s. But here we are. This is John Rede. He'd been fighting in Wiltshire. He was a Wiltshireman from Birdlimes Farm farm in Porton, just outside Salisbury. He'd been fighting under the Republican Edmund Ludlow. Edmund Ludlow was later a regicide, somebody who signs the death warrant for Charles I. He fought in the Battle of Salisbury. He was left by Ludlow in command of the Belfry, which was then a freestanding structure in the close in Salisbury. Ludlow was surprised by overwhelming royalist forces in a sort of midwinter battle in 1644. Rede was captured, then exchanged or possibly rescued by some of the Salisbury Puritans. Anyway, he had a military history long before he arrived at Putney in 1647. He had an extremely long life. He didn't die till he was 95. He married for the third time when he was 78. He was described after his death, remembered after his death, as a violent Republican and independent. He was clearly something of a charismatic figure. It was said in his youth that he could vault from the first trooper's horse into the saddle of the fourth trooper's horse. So if you imagine what that means, 4 troopers lined up on their horses, he could vault from the first saddle into the, you know, quite a trick if you can do it, I imagine. So this is our man. He was, as I say, appointed to Poole on the last day of the Putney debates. He was, this is his seal. Sorry for the slightly fuzzy enlargement. That's it in its real size. This is his marriage certificate to his final wife, Sarah Bernhardt. This is his seal here. As you can see, he's 78, and something very bad is happening to his signature at this stage. I've seen earlier very clear examples of his signature. I'm not sure quite whether, if that's your signature, you are properly married at the end of that. But anyway, there we are. So he gets sent down to Poole, and he's already certainly in contact and knows about the Levellers. William Clark, the man who took down the transcript of the Putney debates, is obviously a personal friend of his. He sends him a letter a little bit later, a little bit after he was appointed, describing what's happening to John Lilburne and the Levellers in London, describing the possibility of a Leveller and radical plot to seize some of the towns, Hereford and Ludlow in the Welsh marshes, and he's clearly engaged with those people. At the end of this letter that Clark sends to him, he says, "Give my regards to Mr. Lockyer." Mr. Lockyer is an agitator in the army, Nicholas Lockyer. So it looks very like, from quite early on, Rede knows of, is interested in, is moving in Leveller circles. He's also a radical Baptist, and this is something else which is part of the. Not all Baptists are Levellers, although many Baptists were Levellers, and all Baptists at this point are regarded as kind of hyper radicals in the political spectrum. They're people who want to break. They're described as dippers for adult baptism. They're regarded as kind of, they're almost always connected in the kind of right-wing press and in the heresy hunters, of which there were quite a few, in their pamphlets as with the Levellers. Some of the Levellers were actually, many of their leading figures, and certainly in the second rank, were Baptists themselves, and it kind of fits together. You know, if you're for a more democratic form of church government in which the congregation decides who the preacher will be, that doesn't have a national church, that lays stress on the individual relationship between the believer and God, it's not inevitable, but it's probably more likely that you're going to have more democratic sensibilities about how the state should be run as well. The first argument that John Rede gets into in Poole is about the appointment of a pastor. And the pastor that he wanted to appoint, the existing pastor, had been kicked out by the government, by the Cromwellian administration, really, or the majority in Parliament, because he was insufficiently in tune with the notions of church government and and national government. He was excluded, and before he could be replaced officially, so to say, John Reed promoted a pastor called John Gardner. Now, John Gardner was also a Baptist, had also got some kind of politically radical associates as well, and certainly later on turns up in Coleman Street in London. Coleman Street in London is the kind of Petrograd of the English Revolution. It's the heart of radicalism in the city of London, and he ends up preaching. This is where all the pub preachers and secret presses of the radicals in London are held, and John Gardner turns up in this area. Now, as soon as he attempts to do this, the local elite in Poole, who'd been quite sympathetic when and signed a petition in favour and supportive of Reed when he arrived, kick off big time. The major merchants, George Scott, his eldest son William Scott, his other son George Scott Jr., the mayor William Williams. These are very big merchants in the town, brewers, ship owners, and they're multiply timed mayor of, together and individually, multiple times become mayor of Poole. George Scott is the MP for Poole. When the old royalist MP is kicked out in 1645, George Scott becomes the MP for Poole. John Bingham, who'd been the governor of Poole in the war, and Mark's written a lot about, these are people who'd been on the parliamentary side, have been very, very militarily active in the whole Civil War up to this point. They are a very tight elite in Poole. They've got friends in London. The Dorchester MP Dennis Bond is an ally of theirs. Dennis Bond's relatives become part of the council in Poole just before they finally mount a challenge which gets rid of John Reed. So this attempt to appoint a radical Baptist preacher runs smack into the local elite in Poole. And they write letters to the mayor, and the mayor writes to the governor, and they say, you're trying to force this radical preacher on us. We're not having it. All of us, both independents and Presbyterians, and that's an interesting thing that they say in the letter, we're all agreed that this is a bad idea and you're not going to do it. And Reed backs down in face. He says, I had no plans to force this upon you. Of course, I only appointed him because there was a vacancy and the mayor himself hadn't filled the vacancy, and he backs off. But it doesn't do him a lot of good, to be honest, because then very soon after this, they have another and ultimately successful attempt to remove him entirely as the governor of Poole. And the bottom of this is not just religion, it's politics. When Reed became, just in 1649, just as the revolution is reaching its peak, in weeks before the execution of Charles I, he is one of the signatories of this petition, which is a very interesting single-sheet petition which goes through a number of grievances. There's grievance 1, grievance 2, grievance 3, and then the remedies that are being suggested by the petition follow it all the way through. And what this adds up to, what the grievances and their answers to it add up to, is a radical programme, very like the Levellers' radical programme, and indeed on the bottom of the petition it says that we are supporters of the large petition of the Levellers of the 11th of September 1648, and this was the biggest and most successful of the Leveller petitions ever. It was the key moment where, when there'd been a huge push for a personal treaty with Charles I in the first part of 1648, pro-treaty, pro-royalist petitions have dominated in the city of London. Then Lilburne, who was being held prisoner, is released. He organises the Levellers, constructs an alliance with Cromwell and Arnaton, and in September, the whole petitioning process begins to turn around, and from regiment after regiment and city after city, petitions modelled on this Leveller large petition begin to flow into headquarters and begin to change the whole tenure. And that's the beginning of the process, which eventually ends 6 months later with the execution of the king. So this is one that comes, this petition is from the garrisons of Portsmouth, Southsea, Southampton, Hurst Castle, Poole and Brownsea Castle, or Weymouth, and so it's a South Coast petition, really. And on the bottom of it, from Poole and Hurst, here we have John Reed's John Rede as the second name down here. Here's an old friend, Lieutenant Henry Wansey, who was also fought under Ludlow at the Battle of Salisbury. And over here, here's another name that this is James, spelling's different because it's erratic in the 17th century, but this is James Heam, who was governor in Weymouth. At this stage, by the way, the two people that we talked of earlier, Edward Sexby and George Joyce, Colonel George Joyce, who seized the king at Holdenby, they're also on the south coast, and they're also governors of Portland and other places. Thomas Rainsborough's regiment has been stationed in Portsmouth as well. So there's a bit of a kind of radical independent, leveller inclined network happening across the south coast, and John Rede is part of this. Now, if the elite didn't like John Gardiner, didn't like the radical preacher, they certainly didn't like this kind of politics, and neither did the elite in London by this time, because by 1649, early 1649, the king has been executed, and a council of state, essentially a military government, has been put in place, and the Levellers are now no longer allied with Cromwell against the idea of a personal treaty and the return of the king. They're attempting to carry forward a more radical democratic programme, the agreement of the people, and in a series of mutinies, they're defeated. First of all in Bishopsgate in London, then in a mutiny that begins actually in Salisbury and across the West Country, but ends in Burford. They're defeated militarily, hunted down by Cromwell and Fairfax, and then finally in Oxford, they are, which is the mutiny that started in the Oxford garrison by a man called John Radman, who was distributing John Lilburn's pamphlets, and that's ultimately defeated as well. Where do the Oxford mutineers go, or some of them? They head south to Poole, where they think they're going to have a sympathetic reception from John Rede and his garrison, and indeed they do. John Radman, the leader of the Oxford mutiny, is sheltered by Rede in Poole. So this is completely beyond the bounds of acceptability as far as the Poole elite are concerned. George Scott was profoundly unhappy with the whole course of the way in which the revolution had gone. He, as I said, became an MP in 1645 when the existing royalist MP was kicked out, and he wrote a pamphlet when he himself was excluded from Parliament, in which practically everything that the Long Parliament has done, he absolutely detests. So he writes in this pamphlet, I think we've got here it is, a letter from an ejected member of the House of Commons. Not clear whether he was ejected in Pride's Purge or perhaps earlier when some of the more conservative MPs fled the House of Commons when the army arrived in London. And he's an opponent of the vote of no addresses, which was the vote that Parliament passed, which said we aren't going to negotiate with the king anymore. He hated that. He wanted the king returned. He particularly thought that everything had gone wrong from 1643 onwards. He said at that point, passionate orators, keen to tickle the attention of the Houses, would speak up for turbulent spirits like Lilburne, Burton, Prime and Bastwick, and these were the key figures. John Lilburne, not a leveller, obviously, but also the key figures who in 1643 represented radical Puritanism as well, and parliamentary opposition to the crown. He listed 39 MPs who, in his view, were traitors and rebels, and they included Cromwell, Ireton, and the leveller Thomas Rainsborough. He detested the leveller ally and MP Henry Martin, and he thought that the whole Parliament is neither just, free, or in his words, compos mentis, which, you know, really of all the parliaments that have ruled Britain, probably the Long Parliament was the one in which that would be at least applicable phrase. But anyway, that's that you can see from this that John Rede and George Scott and his allies just weren't going to get along, and they essentially, the Poole elite, essentially organised a coup which removed and the leading group, and the allies that they had, Dennis Bond, the Dorchester MP, is now on the Council of State, the big figure in the Council of State, relying on them to remove Rede. And they write to the Council of State saying, you've got to get rid of this guy. This guy is just too radical. He's associated with the Levellers. He's got to go. And they send a letter with 11 charges in it to the Council of State to justify this. And what they say is he's been sheltering John Radman, he's been sheltering this Leveller, he's been sheltering other Levellers, he's been arguing with Captain Lissington, who's the chief of the garrison, because he arrested some Levellers. He's been promoting this dipper, this Baptist John Gardner. All this is absolutely unacceptable, and they're successful. They get a letter which Dennis Bond brings back saying that he's going to appoint George Scott in place of John Rede. John Rede, then Scott arrives back. He goes first of all to James Hean, who's a friend of Reed's in Weymouth, and says, come with me over to Poole because we've got to eject Rede. Hean says, I'm not going. He's a friend of mine. In fact, he secretly writes that night to Rede, telling him that this is going to happen. Scott goes over to Poole on his own from Weymouth, arrives, confronts Rede. Rede says, if this is all you have, if this letter from the council is all you have, I'm not going. We won't be parting anytime soon. Rede assembles 2 companies of soldiers on the green outside the gates. As he's going towards London to challenge the dismissal order, he overtakes Scott on the road to the gate, and they debate this in front of the 2 companies of troops. Scott reads out his letter from Dennis Bond saying that Reed's got to go. Rede defends himself. 2 companies of soldiers throw their hats in the air in favour of Rede. There's a mutiny going on at this stage, whichever way you look at it. Then Rede makes probably a fatal tactical error. He decides that he'll continue on his way to London. Scott comes back and confronts the 2 companies of soldiers again. They first of all refuse to listen. He says, everybody, put up your hands if you're with me. Nobody puts up their hands. Then one of the captains change sides, and one of the companies votes with Scott. The other one refuses even then to back the removal of Rede. So this is the climax of the whole thing. It's, as I say, it's of a picture with the national events, the way in which the Levellers are first part of the final phase of the revolution in alliance with the independents, and then when that is completed, Cromwell and Ireton turn against the Levellers and suppress the Leveller mutinies at Bishopsgate and at Burford and at Oxford. And if you like, this is the Poole episode. It's the last episode, the kind of last stand of the Leveller supporters, where they remove the victorious Cromwellian military government removes its own radical supporters and supporters of the Levellers. James Hean, who I've just talked about, has some of his troops taken away from him and given to Colonel John Bingham, one of Scott's allies that I've mentioned before, who by this time is military governor of Guernsey. At the same time that Rede is being removed, Cornet George Joyce is removed from his governorship in Portland. Edward Sexby, who we've talked about, who preceded Joyce as governor in Portland, is cashiered from the army. So it's a moment where the new masters are asserting themselves and marginalising what have been up to this point their best but most radical supporters, but who still want to go further than they did. And that's how John Rede was ultimately removed as governor of Poole. He has, as I say, a long life after this. He returns to Wiltshire. He establishes the Portland Baptist Church under illegal conditions. He's at the Restoration. He's put in the Tower of London, called before the government for dissenting religion, escapes, continues, and holds Portland Baptist Church together. And you can go to Portland today, and John Reed's wife's gravestone is still in Portland Baptist Church to this day.
months, or in fact a few years really, in the nation's history, and with Poole sort of taking part in what was going on. So are you happy to answer questions? Has anybody got any questions? Anything that they thought of?
When you said they met on the green outside the gates, was it literally outside, or was it a little way up the road? Because there's an area called Stanley Green. I just wondered if it was there.
To be honest, I don't know. The descriptions of these events aren't that specific.
Because it was a tidal road, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't there, some of the time.
There was a lot of green open space at that time.
Yeah.
Particular in the town. I wanted to ask something, if I might, about the letter from the ejected member.
Yes.
Is it proven that it's George Scott? Because if it was, obviously that's a very interesting document for the history of the town.
It's not signed on the cover. The attribution in early English books online, which is the archive and so forth, and from the British Library, is that it's Scott. It looks to me from internal evidence as if that's right.
I supplement that. Why is it sent to John Evelyn? What's his role at this particular point?
Well, Evelyn, perhaps not everyone knows, John Evelyn is a sort of Wiltshire, again a Wiltshireman. I think he's living in Malmesbury, isn't he? An antiquarian, and he would have been politically sympathetic, I think, to Scott. Not if this is Scott, and I think it is, not as extreme in his views, but he would have been sympathetic to this kind of argument. So I assume, at this stage, there's obviously quite a lot of interaction between various figures broadly on the parliamentarian side, down here and in Wiltshire. One of Rede's wives is from Purbeck. The county committees have some links. Obviously, the parliamentarian side are all under Waller at this stage. So I don't know how Scott would have necessarily known John Evelyn, but I can see where he would imagine that he would get a sympathetic political hearing if he wrote this kind of letter to Evelyn.
Can I make a comment? Because I'm not sure which Scott it was, but because after the Restoration the Scotts became mayor, and it was one of them entertained the King's son, Charles II, on a well-known trip around Brownsea Island. So I think it sort of shows how, this sort of from being a rebel in the 1640s, it all became acceptable to entertain the King in a house which used to stand up something like the High Street. Jenny would know exactly where. Not that she was here at the time, but
yeah, and that, as I see on the pub there, the picture of the boat, it was the Scots boat that took Charles II out round the harbour. Now, I think with the Scots, you've got some people who are kind of dead centre of the parliamentarian side. They were reluctant to fight, but when they fought with some tenacity. As soon as the possibility of a social settlement which would stabilise it for wealthy merchants and people of the political elite, they took it, and the Restoration really wasn't a problem for them at all. Which is interesting because it was a problem for Rede.
yes, obviously, yeah. He's a great survivor, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know whether Rede was a particular Baptist or a general Baptist.
Particular
I've been reading a bit about the particular Baptist, Thomas Collier, recently, and in some letters he was writing, he was appointed as a chaplain in the New Model Army around the time of the Putney debates, and he talks about 16 new converts in Poole, and I wonder whether they might play a part in this story in any way. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't know that, but I'm interested. Very likely, I would have thought. Just for people who aren't familiar, the kind of basic distinction is that for particular Baptists, only some people would be saved. The elect would be saved. For General Baptist, as the name indicates, everybody could be saved. So some of the most authoritative studies of this kind of thing, Murray Tolmie's book, for instance, suggests that General Baptists were more likely to be levellers than particular Baptists. And when that kind of alliance between the churches broke apart around 1649, the kind of particular Baptists were less sympathetic. Rede, of course, is a counterexample to this. He is a particular Baptist, and the Porton Baptist Church was a particular Baptist church, but he is one of the last men standing defending the levellers towards the end of their most successful period. So that I'm not saying that the general picture is wrong, but it can't be regarded as an absolute guide, certainly. And I'm very interested. There's all sorts of other bits and pieces about Quaker activity in this area, and as with a lot of the West Country, there's a very strong dissenting tradition, which is one of the lines of dissent from these times to ours. One of the things that Rede gets into to trouble for, and he's hauled up in front of the Quarter Sessions in the long into the Restoration for this, and part of the Quarter Sessions judgment says, of long experience we know that these people understand nothing but the suppression of the law, because they keep on organising these radical congregations. In the North Bradley Baptist Church, which I think members of Rede's family were also engaged with, they were having meetings in the woods of 2,000 people. This is 2,000 people in rural Wiltshire in the 17th century. I don't know what that would be. 200,000 people now or something. So these, certainly the political momentum of radicalism is broken by successively the Cromwellian Republic and the Restoration, but those things are definitely still going on, for a long, long time after that. But I'm very interested to see the Collier stuff. Very interested.
I was supposed to know, I think Jenny probably writes it. So what do we know about the history of baptism in Poole as the earliest Baptist? I know there's the Baptist Church, but that's dated in the 1800s. Was there a primitive Baptist at one time in Poole? I just wonder if there's any records that survived of the Baptist.
I can't really answer that, I don't think.
No, probably don't ask this bit.
I mean, I must say, I think there's lots more to find out. I've pieced together the kind of picture from the point of view of how it was happening here. I wanted to do two things, really. The historian Ian Gentles, who's written a brilliant book about the New Model Army, said that the kind of second and third tiers of the Leveller movement aren't very well known. We know about John Lilburn, we know about John Wildman, we know about Richard Overton. Not as much as perhaps we could, but we do. But what made it a movement is what was happening with people like John Rees, what connections they were making, who they were operating with, who they were allied to, and who their enemies were. And I wanted to kind of, get some of that picture out of this. But I think there's a lot more to tell. I mean, where was Rede living when he was in Governor of Poole? I don't know. He certainly bequeathed some property in Poole in his will. Where is it? I don't know. So there's what were the moderate, the Levellers newspaper, bizarrely so called, reports from Poole about the state of the poor. So were there other Levellers as well as Rede in Poole? Probably, in my view. So there's a lot. This is a first attempt. There's lots more to go, I'd say.
Anybody else? Question? Well, I think we've had a very remarkable, something a bit different for us, sort of talk this afternoon, and hopefully we've all learnt something. We'll go away and perhaps follow up some of the ideas that have come up. So thank you very much.
Thank you.